The ugly and rusty EVO is running and drivable, and in this episode we'll show you how it got there. So we are back at ASM for day 2 of assembling this ugly EVO build. One of the first things we had to do was replace the driver's side front CV shaft, also known as a half shaft. Andy noticed that transmission fluid had actually filled up inside the drive shaft portion here that you're going to see. Someone actually, when they put this old one in, must have been way too hard on trying to get it in place and kind of slammed it in. You can see this little piece inside of the CV shaft. You can see the good one where it looks like there's an actual plate in there to keep the grease in where it needs to be. And on this old rusty one, it's a little hard to see, but there's basically that piece was all smashed up, so the grease wasn't being held in place like it was supposed to. Now, amazingly, like, this was kind of hard to find. CV shafts for these cars, OEM is always best. I've heard people saying the aftermarket ones always tend to leak. But when you're limited in options and on a budget, there's not a whole lot you can do. Luckily, this one, I believe, was $80 from AutoZone, and they actually had 2 of them in stock, so I have 2 of them now, just in case. Another thing I wanted to do right away was install a wideband gauge. If you've watched my wideband video that I've made in the past, you know that I preach the importance of having a wideband in a car so you can kind of monitor things and know what's going on. It's a great safety tool to have in place. So while this car is up on the hoist, I'm just going to install that wideband O2 sensor here and run that wire up to inside the cabin for the gauge. I haven't finished this install yet to the gauge, but while I had access to putting this car on the hoist, it was definitely something I wanted to do. And the way I ran this O2 sensor wire is pretty much where the rear O2 sensor would typically go. So I ran it up and fed the wire through. This is the passenger seat, the front passenger seat, and ran the wire up through there. And then we had to bolt all the exhaust components back in place. So we got our downpipe bolted back up. And throughout this episode, I'm probably going to speak to things I wasn't able to entirely film while I was working on them or Andy was working on it. So one thing I do want to mention here is that I do have basically an oil cooler block off right now running with this engine. We decided that it wasn't worth risking the old OEM oil cooler. The main reason is that, you know, if there was bearing material in the oil pan and stuff, and if any of that gets in your oil cooler, it's pretty much impossible to wash. So I did not want to take the risk of ruining a brand new engine by installing an old oil cooler. But I will say I do have the STM kit on the way for an oil cooler, so I will be installing that in the future. Again, I did make a video on this, on changing at least the OEM oil cooler lines, and I believe I mentioned in the video that if I had to do it all over again, I would just get the STM kit or some other aftermarket kit, simply because the lines themselves, if you buy brand new OEM lines, they're like over $200 just for both lines, and you could get a whole brand new kit for about $360. So that will be coming, but for now, we're just running a block off, so we don't actually have an oil cooler in place currently, which I will say should be fine for now, but you really do just want an oil cooler on there, something to cool your oil temperatures. So then I had to install a lot of the basic setup, putting on the front mount intercooler, putting on the upper intercooler pipe, lower intercooler pipe, bolted all that stuff back on. This is a stock front mount intercooler that I picked up somewhere along the way. Somehow I have 3 of these stock front mount intercoolers now. The one that was on the car looked kind of like corroded and stuff. Again, probably, you know, rust and everything. So even though it is aluminum, I decided to throw in this other one that is a little bit more dented, but actually kind of seemed better overall. So we're running this one for now. Intercooler piping setup, I do have the engine upper intercooler pipe and the engine air intake. So this setup should work just fine for what I want to do with the car. And also right now we don't have our boost controller installed yet, so all we're doing is running wastegate pressure, and in order to do that, we just run a vacuum hose direct from the J-pipe to the turbo wastegate. Again, not shown here, but that is what the current setup is. I do have a Grimspeed 3-port boost controller, so I will be hooking that up in the near future as well. But for now, a lot of this is really just about breaking this engine in, trying to drive this car a little bit, get things sorted out without making too many changes. So again, just running a stock EVO mass airflow sensor with that engine air intake pipe setup, and a K&N air filter. But of course, I did upgrade the blow-off valve. If you're new to EVOs, the stock EVO 8 blow-off valve is plastic, and it's kind of a piece of junk, known to leak pretty easily. So this, you can run an EVO 9 or an EVO 10 is a cheap, effective upgrade to run that EVO 9 or EVO 10 blow-off valve. So I don't remember which one this is. I actually think this is the EVO 10 blow-off valve that I put in here. And yep, running that vacuum hose, connecting that back up from the blow-off valve to the intake manifold port. And then the lower intercooler pipe setup here is running stock for now because I didn't have the coupler to adapt to my other one, and I'm also waiting for that EVO 9 J pipe. So I will be running an aftermarket lower intercooler pipe. This is definitely an area that's worth upgrading if you're looking for some cheap horsepower on your EVO. The stock lower intercooler pipe is pretty restrictive, so it's worth an investment to upgrade to an aftermarket one if you haven't already. And of course, a lot of things were plugged in, a lot of things were buttoned up, adding a lot of fluids, coolants, of course, all that kind of stuff before you end up firing it up. But it did come down to that moment of truth, that first fire up, starting up that brand new short block, starting that engine up. You know, it's a little nerve-wracking for me, of course, and not everyone might feel the same way, but, you know, before we got too far along getting everything kind of put together, we definitely wanted to fire up and make sure it was running okay. And just to give you a true glimpse of kind of how this goes, I'm going to show you this clip unedited. I'm just going to show you a bit. You know, it took a while to crank before it fired. Just kind of want to show you what the experience was like here.
Plug the crank sensor in. Try it again. Try it again. Keep doing it again. Back down.
So yeah, it ran. It sounded good. There was a little tingy like noise that I heard on higher acceleration that kind of freaked me out at first, but we're fairly certain it's just something with the exhaust. The exhaust has this weird kind of rattle that happens at higher RPMs right now. And honestly, once I took this car out on the road, I didn't even notice it at all. So I think we're good, but you know, fingers crossed. I'm certainly not saying 100% that everything's fine yet. We need to certainly do a bit more with this car to make sure. So of course, now I'm just bolting on a few more of the front end parts, getting that actual front bumper in place, along with each headlight. And I also wanted to kind of update. I know if you watched my video about tearing down the EVO throttle body, people had mentioned about how I removed some film and some coating that would make it idle incorrectly, or perhaps not idle at all. I will say we were able to successfully start this car. It runs, it idles just fine. We did some adjustments with the BIS screw, but it did not seem to be a huge issue. So just kind of an update on that. If you did happen to clean your throttle body similar to the way I did, it shouldn't like totally make it undrivable or anything, but I can follow up with that again as well once I get a bit more into this car. So yep, installing more parts. We got the whole front end of the car back together. And then one other thing I really wanted to do was change these front struts, because these front struts were so rusty. They were literally pretty much falling in on themselves. The tire was starting to rub because there was so much rust and these were so bad. So I had a used set of OEM suspension that I'm going to swap in the front and the rear, but all I had time to do for this one was swap in the front. And I'm only going to show you one side, but of course I did both sides. And here's the comparison between the old one. Have you seen such rust? Like, especially in an EVO. It's amazingly sad to me that it got so bad. But at least a part like that can be easily swapped out. I am pretty confident in the front half of this car, at least as of right now, as far as rust stuff goes. Having cleaned up the engine bay, having swapped this suspension, and looking at that actual like lower front cross member and stuff, it's all relatively solid up there. I wouldn't want to have to remove it at this point because that would probably be a nightmare. But I'm not, concerned about it falling apart. Can't say the same for the rear quite yet, but we'll tackle that when we get to it. So once we had the front end back together, had that front suspension swapped out, started it up, let it run a little bit more, made sure it shifted through all the gears. I do have to say it does shift through all the gears. The transmission seems okay, even though it was a big unknown. Thought about having it rebuilt while it was out, but just in the time frame we had, just wanting to get this car up and running and didn't really want to add another variable to everything. We just decided to put the transmission back in. And it does shift fine, but the shifter itself, and I'm chalking it up to the shifter linkage because it does look really rusty. It's just very tight. You know how typically when you let go of the shifter and bring it to neutral, it just kind of settles in neutral? This shifter does not want to settle. Like if you're shifting 1 to 2 and then you're going to go to 3, you need to make sure you move the shifter over to the right before you go into 3 because it never wants to settle back towards the middle. So that's what I'll be working on next. That's one of the most important things I'm going to be working on actually, is making sure this thing can shift right. I ordered a whole bunch of shifter parts, OEM stuff. I ordered some Torque Solutions shifter bushings, but then any other OEM part I could get for shifter linkage, I ordered that as well. So I'll be doing that pretty soon. So here it is. It is a running car. So we're going to do a little walk around and show you what it sounds like. I will say I'm super glad if you heard those cams. I love the sound in the EVO with the lopey cam, and I'm surprised these GSC S1s actually have such a lope to them. It's pretty cool. And even on this exhaust is pretty quiet overall. So I took it up and down the road, made sure it was drivable, and it again seemed to drive relatively well, but there's still plenty to do. There's a lot to do on this car. Plans coming up, if everything is going well enough like we want it to, we're going to swap in some 1200cc injectors and we're going to switch over to E85. But of course, as I mentioned, I got to check that shifter linkage out first. I got to swap out a J-pipe yet. I got to install an oil cooler yet. So there's a lot of things that are going to be coming up. And hey, 20 feet away, walking around this car, it almost looks like a relatively normal EVO, even though it is probably one of the rustiest EVOs you'll ever see. So that is about it for this episode, everybody. As always, I appreciate you watching. If I did anything catastrophically wrong, please let me know, or even minorly, leave comments in the comment section down below and continue that discussion. But as always, this is Paul from Boosted Film saying thanks so much for watching.